My name is Sanchi. I'm the Decarbonization Advisor and the Fundraising Manager at Solar Options for Schools. Thank you so much to everyone for joining this webinar. We've got 45 minutes. We're going to go through a presentation for the first part of it and then be taking questions in the latter half. To start off, can I please ask everyone to introduce themselves in the chat? So please, can you put in your name, the council that you are from, and one thing that you would like to get out of this webinar. So it could be just getting to know what solar looks like for your net zero plans, and you might be very early on in that journey, or it could be something very specific about sign-off processes or procurement, but just one thing that you would like to get out of this webinar. And with that, I'll pass over to our speaker, Robert, to introduce himself.
Thank you, Sanchi. And I think, as Sanchi alluded to, very keen to make this as interactive. This is sort of a learning opportunity for all of us too. This is a journey that we're all going down and learning as we go. So really looking forward to your questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, experiences. So I'll try and rattle through the presentation quite quickly, but do store up your questions or ask questions as I go along to clarify. Some of you know us, some of you don't. So I will spend a little bit of introduction time on what we are. So our agenda is about us and why do we only do schools, a little bit about our education, what we do. I want to spend some time on some case studies with councils of how we worked with councils in the past or currently, and then how we'd like to sort of work with you to collectively help more schools go solar. So a little bit about us. We set up about 9 years ago. The purpose was to empower young people to decarbonize. It became pretty obvious to me that whilst we all are worried about climate change, we're all rather busy in our day-to-day lives to do much about it. The next generation is very worried about climate change and feel rather powerless to do anything about it. But there's an opportunity to empower them and teach them about energy and decarbonization. And clearly that needs to be taking place at schools. Most schools around the world struggle to provide basic literacy in maths, let alone decarbonization and energy education. So the idea is that we use the sun to fund that education. And so that's why our strapline is energy and decarbonization education funded by the sun. In order for all that to happen, though, the schools have to have solar panels first. And so we've built a whole bunch of software and services around enabling schools to go solar more easily. From finding sources of funding, developing it, working out what's possible, managing it, monitoring it, and then enabling us to then deliver the education piece. And so far, we look after about 300 schools with solar panels actually not just in the UK, in a number of countries, about 250 in the UK. We think that makes us now the largest manager of solar assets on schools. And we're adding about 100 schools a year. Some of those that we are helping to develop and some that we're adopting from existing systems that need looking after and want the education piece. But there is so much more that needs to be done and could be done. And that's kind of why we want to work closer with councils to make it happen faster. There are about 30,000 schools in the UK, and it just takes a very, very long time. And there is a number of tricks that we've learned along the way, and some of those keys making it go faster lie in your hands. And so we hope to be able to share that with you so that more schools can happen sooner. Very briefly on our education impact, we've got an education report. I've attached a link at the bottom, or Sanchi's very kindly put a link at the bottom that you can look at in your own time. But it's a sort of a little bit of an insight as to what we do. And in photographs, typically what we do as part of managing the system when we visit the school each year to check the system, we do this
Sorry,
through...
Robert, do you want to share your screen at this point?
Oh, bother. Sorry, I hadn't realized I wasn't sharing my screen. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Okay, you've missed a few pictures and nothing too... Okay, there's a picture of a few of us on a roof, not particularly exciting. The sort of snapshot of our education report, and then I was showing you some pictures of some of our education visits. And our key thing is, if people can't understand what a kilowatt hour is, which is the basic unit of measurement of electricity or energy consumption, then where do we start? And so one of the exercises we have is around visualizing what a kilowatt hour is. And what we use is the idea of children cycling. and a child cycling quite hard is about 100 watts of output. If you put 10 students each on a bicycle pedaling hard, that's 1,000 watts, 1 kilowatt. If they do it for an entire hour, they would produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. So now you have a visual representation of a kilowatt hour. 10 students pedaling hard for an hour. Yeah, it's a start. But most people can describe a pound of sugar, but now at least you can describe and visualize a kilowatt hour of electricity. So that's the starting point. We then have some software tools, for example, our panelizer that allows the students to see how much solar panels could be put onto the school, and then also the data from the existing systems can be used in maths and physics and geography and linked to the curriculum. A brief slide on, I think this is probably teaching you all to suck eggs, and I'm preaching to the converted, given that you're in this session already. But it might be useful when you're going back to your teams to sort of illustrate how putting solar on a school in your council can actually help with some of the council's own goals around lowering emissions, increasing the adoption of renewables and reducing carbon from a behavioral change perspective. It also improves educational outcomes. Students are motivated when they learn something that they can see is relevant to their lives. And then also it builds local energy generation capacity. So I think that's reasonably obvious, but might be useful internally. Again, a rather dull slide, but just a quick overview of what we do. And I think the key point here is we are not a solar installer. We work with councils, trusts, dioceses, schools, to help them go solar. Everything from the detailed desktop survey, which we'll come back to in a minute, to understand what the potential is, through full feasibility studies to make sure it's possible, then construction management, and that goes from selecting and managing installers, selecting and procuring the equipment, and then commissioning the systems on behalf of the schools or the council. And then asset management, remote monitoring, visual inspections, and invoicing. So, for example, if a council sets up its own funding process and wants to use the PPA to then recoup its funding, we can then manage that process for the council too. Energy education, which we talked about before, and then the various different funding options, which we'll touch on a little bit. But it ranges from third-party funded through things like the Solar for Schools Community Benefit Society or local community energy groups, through to some councils setting up their own funds, or some councils having access to grants that they can use. And then also a combination of grants and donations. So we've got a partnership with the National Grid, who provide about $500,000 a year to councils in their region. And we're just about to engage another partnership with another DSO for about $100,000 a year to put batteries into smaller schools where the economics wouldn't otherwise work. But solar plus a battery then makes the economics stack up so that it can be funded by a third party. We also work with a number of commercial funds who provide the funding for these systems, although most of the schools that we have done and look after have chosen to use the Solar for Schools Community Benefit Society, which is a not-for-profit society set up and managed by the schools themselves. So every school that is funded by it becomes a member of that society and has a vote in it. So they're not signing up to a 25-year agreement with some faceless corporation. They're signing up to a society of schools, basically joining a club of schools who then raise the money from bondholders through platforms such as Ethics. And we manage that entire process. And the CBS has raised about £8 million to date and has funded 210 schools so far. So that's one of the sort of the funding options. But we work with councils to help them decide what makes sense. Some councils have access to funds or have the ambition to set up their own funds, such as their own local sort of energy funds, and others don't have the capacity to do so and then lean on us to raise the money through the CBS or through local community energy groups. Hopefully that's enough on that. Then moving swiftly on to some of the councils and dioceses that are engaging with us. So one of the challenges for council is that you're not really meant to endorse or promote a single supplier. And so we've put solar on schools, on council buildings across the entire country. And typically that means that the school wants to go ahead and we then go to the council for landlord consent, which is quite a painful process the first time. And I'll illustrate that in a second. Having done that, some councils then actually go quite proactive. So Durham was the first council that we worked with proactively, and we did about 20 schools with them about a decade ago now, nearly. Leeds City Council, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is very proactive, and Redbridge and Sheffield, which I'll talk about a little bit more, are much more recent and work in a slightly different way. So let's just go through some of those examples. So Leeds City Council, we first engaged with them about 7 years ago when a small school, I think it was called Seven Hills Primary, wanted to go solar. Very keen, very enthusiastic school. And thanks to their enthusiasm, we persevered with the council at the time. And after about a year and a half, Leeds City Council got through the internal hurdles and hoops that they had to go through to sign off on that first lease for that project. And then subsequently, actually, then having gone through that quite painful process, initially became very, very proactive. And we've since worked with Leeds to do nearly 50 projects, about 8 projects a year. We've currently got 4 in development. And the collective output of those is about 1,800 tons of CO2 savings a year. The schools are all saving money. These projects were funded by a mixture of the council, which meant they had to go for a procurement process, and they're funding about a third of the solar PV projects through some of the money from the PSDS. So they're putting heat pumps in, partly funding the solar, and then the rest of the solar has been funded by the Solar for Schools Community Benefit Society. And the combination of a bit of PSDS grant plus Solar for Schools CBS funding means that they've got some very, very low power purchase agreement prices. So the schools are paying very low prices for their solar electricity. So that's a great example. PSDS is no longer operating, so the number of schools that they are partly funding is dropping, but we're still doing a few where the economics work without a little bit of a top up from the council. Redbridge Council is much more recent. Again, it started with one school, Churchfields Junior, who was very keen about 2 years ago. The council actually was very positive and very engaged from the beginning. We were fortunate to sort of be involved with the councillor, and all the school brought the councillor on board. The councillor brought the rest of the council on board. There we had some challenges around some technical issues around the school, so it took a little while. But once that first project was completed, Redbridge then ramped up its proactive engagement from starting last November, where they did a few events, and then from January, February, they've been encouraging schools to work with us. And again, it's a very fine line as to what they're allowed to say. But it makes a massive difference if a school knows that a council is on board with the solar scheme. Yeah, because there's a very bad joke that it takes 20 people to put solar on a school, 1 person to install it, 3 people to then get the other 16 people on board. Yeah, and those 16 other people are starting with the school itself, head teacher, governors, business manager, but then about a dozen of them are the council itself, procurement, estates, legals, decarbonisation. And if the school knows that the other 10 are already on board, the council's already on board, it encourages them to actually go ahead and do it. They don't see it as a sort of very difficult challenge. They see it as, okay, the councils are supportive. If we do our due diligence on our piece in terms of the supplier, then the council will agree to the long-term agreement. And that makes a massive difference, because in Redbridge, our typical time for school to say, engage with us and go yes, and the fallout rate is maybe 1 in 10 go ahead normally, and can take 6 months to 3 years to make a decision. In Redbridge, we've started this process. We've had 35 schools engage. 10 of them have already are going through the process. 4 of them have already been completed, and this is since January. So the first one plus another 3. So 3 more have been completed, the most recent one last month. 6 are in development, which will be completed within the next 6 to 8 months. And there's another 25 going through the process. So it's gone from a 1 in 10 hit ratio and years sometimes to go ahead to a much, much better ratio and a much, much faster process. So at this rate, we're probably doing maybe 5 to 10 schools with Redbridge per year over the next few years. And because Redbridge is not funding any of it themselves, they're achieving their carbon reductions and their education benefits at no cost to the council, just simply by engaging and working alongside us. And then finally, I want to do one more example case study, which is the most recent one. Sheffield Council originally came to us through, or introduced to us through, a local community energy initiative. And Matt, I think, may be on the call from Sheffield. I can't see. Then led through some due diligence. I know what bits of diligence they did on our side. They asked for some quotes on installation costs that they were looking at to make sure that we were competitive. I can go into more detail as to why we're competitive around that too. And they reviewed our systems and processes and probably did some other bits of due diligence too. I'm sure you're welcome to ask Matt. They then looked at their procurement options, because in their case, they want to actually raise or put together a £1 million fund, which they get a raise through bonds, I believe. And they would like us to then manage that process of the sort of the billing back to the schools and helping them manage that fund. And in order to do that, they're going to have to go through a full procurement process. But in order to keep the ball rolling, they're testing the waters with a paid initial desktop review of 20 of the 68 schools out of 235 in the area. Those 68 schools are ones that they still directly control rather than having moved over into a trust. And then the plan is to then do full feasibility studies on 2 of them, which basically means structural surveys, planning permission, grid connection applications, etc., to then come up with a full design specification that they could put out to tender. Or in this particular case, they want to put out the whole end-to-end solution to tender, so that we can then, if we win it, and assuming we win it, do the whole from initial desktop full all the way through to asset management and education and billing. So it's a little bit more complicated. We started this project, the kickoff was actually this morning, and that kind of leads into my demo.
Also, I just wanted to check if Matt is on the call and if he wanted to interject or if he wanted to speak or contribute at all. If not, no worries.
He might be.
Yes, I'm here,
busy.
but
Oh, hi, Matt.
Hi, Matt. Sorry to put you on the spot.
no, it's absolutely fine. I am here. Nothing really more to add at this point, but yeah, happy to answer questions anyone's got about kind of the process that we've gone through and everything like that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So there are, let's go back to this. So just, you can still see my screen. You should be able to see sort of our source of software platform. In order to do the initial assessment and trying to prioritize projects, we have linked with the government school database into a tool set. So we can look up the schools in any particular trust, council, diocese, city, or an individual school. We have that in a number of countries, but I guess only the UK is relevant at this stage. So on Sheffield, we can see they have 235 schools with 93,000 students between them. If I then click on that, it will bring up, actually might take a while. So there's a gallery view too, so I can see every school in the council. In this particular case, Matt explained to us that obviously only the ones that they're still responsible for are relevant. So we've created a portfolio for Matt where we've put all 68 schools in that they would be potentially funding themselves or developing themselves. And the plan is to then select 20 out of these 68. And this morning at a kickoff, a call literally an hour ago, we determined some criteria that we're going to then apply to filter those 68 down to pick 25. And we're going to sort of filter out any that, for example, we know that the building is going to be rebuilt or shut down, etc., etc. But then the rest are going to be prioritized based on the financial savings that they will achieve in their first year. And that will then pull out 20 sites. And then on each of those 20 sites that we've then narrowed it down to, we will then do a initial desktop review. And here's one that's been done earlier. So we use our tool to put panels on the relevant buildings. This is linked to a very sophisticated financial model, which factors in current costs of construction of a system of that size and takes the yield from that location based on the orientation of the panels. It uses the consumption of the school as provided by the council or the school to estimate what proportion of the production of the system will be used by the school itself, and what of the total of the school it will replace, and provides a lot of details in terms of what the system will cost, and what the long-term savings will be. And we then use this to provide those initial desktop reports that the council can then use to help engage with the schools and get them across the line. If you go to school and say, hey, look, we can provide you with a system that's not going to cost you anything, you'll just be paying in this particular case, I'm not sure what the PPA is, hang on. Where's the PPA gone? That's not probably correct. This is the school funding at CPS. So in this case, the school could enter into a PPA agreement at 21.2p, and that's what they pay. And that's based on the CBS funding it. We have a number of different funding options. So what we'll do at some point, we'll add the Sheffield's funding option into this system so that we can then generate accurate reports for Sheffield to present to the schools. So that's just a bit of a highlight for how we then help Sheffield to narrow down and proactively work on identifying schools that would make sense, provided some documentation. We can then look at various different options. So various different options, and then we can then produce a presentation that they can then, the council can then send to the school. We can also download it as a spreadsheet and various other different ways, but a whole set of tools to provide you with the information you need to make some decisions. So that's a sort of high-level demo of the desktop feasibility piece. If you want, I can also show you a little bit more about how we then manage the assets and their performance and so on. And this is sort of this tool where we've got every single one of our assets around the country, and then we can see how they're performing, and we've got a record of what equipment they use, etc., etc. But this is sort of at the other end of the story as part of then organizing and managing the systems later. But back to the presentation.
Just wanted to pause at this moment because that's a lot of information, and check if anyone had any questions on what we've discussed so far. You can feel free to put your question in the chat or raise your hand and voice it yourself.
So, so I think as I was pointing out that the key way a council can help is by providing a level of reassurance to the school that from a landlord perspective, you are in favor of them going solar. It's just, you don't have to promote us, you don't have to endorse us, but it's what you should be doing is working with some suppliers, it doesn't have to be us, that you trust, that you can encourage the schools to then go down that journey. They obviously have to, the governors of each school have to do their own due diligence around procurement, etc., but at least they know they don't have the additional hurdle having to persuade the council. Then that is a massive battle that you can help with. And if you want to be more proactive than that, then do as much due diligence as on us or any supplier you wish to work with, so that you feel comfortable enough to not recommend or endorse, but at least make the right kind of noises to the school that should they go down that route, they're not going to hit a barrier. If you want to go beyond that, we can then work with you to identify schools that are viable and have the most impact, like we've just illustrated with Sheffield. And in the case of Redbridge, they then helped arrange various events, typically best at a school that's already got solar. So sometimes we do one, and then on the back of that first school, we then invite other schools. That works extremely well. You could help the schools by funding desktop reviews before, as part of the outreach, as Sheffield's doing. You can provide guidance on how they need to go through their diligence process, so that they know what they need to do to get the tick box from you, so to speak. And then you can reassure them that once they've done that, that you will process the landlord approval piece quickly. And now this is again in the situation where either the councils get funded for a separate fund for a PPA. And maybe you should just double check that everyone's familiar with the power purchase agreement and how these schemes work. But if you want me to spend 2 minutes on that, someone make a note of it in the chat. But even on the basis that most systems are now funded through something like a power purchase agreement, that requires a long-term lease approval. And that's the bit that the landlord, i.e. the council, needs to be comfortable with. And so if you've done the diligence on that beforehand, that's a level of reassurance to the schools that they're not going to waste their time doing their due diligence and then hit a blocker at your end. And then once you've got it running, celebrate the fact that you've been involved in helping another school go solar, and do come along to one of our launch events.
Just on that point, very quickly, Churchfields in Redbridge is celebrating their anniversary in September. They're inviting schools, they're inviting councillors. I don't know if anyone from Redbridge Council has joined this session today and has already received the invite, but if that is something that anyone else, particularly any of the London councils, would be interested in, then I will be including information about that in the follow-up email. And just before you continue on this slide, Robert, we've already got quite a few questions. I can see a hand that's already up. So do you want to share what you're thinking, James?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, it took a while to come off mute. I thought it'd be quicker to say something rather than write it. So, I mean, in terms of what Robert was saying, and obviously we're talking to you, Robert, about a school in Trafford. The kind of the support from the council, the tricky thing for us is, I mean, it's okay to get support for solar on schools, but my estates team just say they want, when it comes to local authority maintained schools, they want to be focusing on schools that have their own capital to invest in the solar. What they're nervous about is specifically the leasing, is the PPA, and that's the sticking point. And what I can't do is get any kind of upfront approval that they're happy with the leasing approach until they've really tested it. But I think they have concerns around leasing the roof space for a long period of time, about any risks that might fall on the council, what it might mean if there are repairs and things needed to the roofs, what it might do to roof warranties. They've got a whole long list of things they're nervous about, hopefully most of which we can sort of work through with you and address and deal with. But I think that's the real challenge. It's just a general nervousness, and they're talking to a lot of other councils in Greater Manchester, talking to the estates teams and the schools teams, who all feel very nervous about leasing generally. It's not just solar for schools, it's Greater Manchester Community Renewables, it's just the leasing approach generally. So the more you can provide just to say, this will reassure you about the leasing approach and sort of mitigating the risks, the more that would, I think, help us. Thank you.
That's an extremely good point. It's not surprising that anyone would be nervous about entering into a 25-year commitment. It is a 25-year commitment. I mean, that's a long, long time. And councils and government have been a little bit stung by PFIs, and the lessons from PFIs, or the fear of PFIs, kind of moves over into this long-term leases. And I think, and they're right to be worried about them, but I think it's worth looking at these leases closely. And that's where, especially on this point, where this process from start to finish, the first bit is determine your funding options. I mean, if a council is going to fund these projects themselves, or they have the capital themselves, then they have to go for a procurement route in terms of who's going to do it. If it's going to be third-party funded, but procurement is less of a challenge, it's the legal piece. And the legal piece is absolutely, as you state, the lease. There's a couple of things. I mean, because the Solar for Schools Community Benefit Society, which is the lease that most of the schools that we work with enter into, because the CBS is a not-for-profit who's effectively owned by the schools that become members, it has been designed to be as school-friendly as possible. And the examples of that are that if the school needs to re-roof, the CBS will cover the cost of removing it and replacing it, and there are no penalties for lost energy. So that's one of the first ones that people worry about. What happens if? The second one is, what happens if a school shuts down? With the Solar for Schools CBS lease, again, no contingent liability. You contact the CBS and say, really sorry, shutting down the school, please remove the system. The CBS as a whole takes a hit, yeah, and then within the CBS, the PPA prices are set based on delivering an IIR back to the fund that is about 1% higher than the cost of capital. And that 1% is a buffer. That buffer will go back to the schools if it's not used up as the profit share element. But if lots of schools shut down, that buffer will shrink. Hopefully not so to the point where bondholders can't be repaid. But the CBS builds up reserves and is holding on to those reserves for just those eventualities. Now, there is an argument and a discussion that we're currently having with, or about to have with the DFE around the treatment of PPAs with contingent liabilities. So you might want to have a lease that says, actually, if the school shuts down, the council or the DFE will repay the residual value of that system. Now, if we do that at the moment, which we don't, it actually counts as a debt at the Treasury level. So there's a challenge there. But there's an argument to say that if the DFE underwrote that risk, rather than the community energy groups who are funding it having to underwrite that risk, you could bring down your return expectation from 7 to 6, for example, and that would mean that the PPAs would drop a little bit too. At the moment, though, most community energy groups should be providing a non-contingent liability, non-long-term risks to them. Not some of the commercial providers don't do that, but most of those who focus on the school sector are heading in that direction. The other possible sources of risk to a estate manager are what happens at the end of the 25 years. The Solar for School CBS one basically states that the school can choose to have it removed at no cost or to keep it at no cost. Yeah, some out there basically force the school to buy it back for £1. And that sounds like a good deal, but maybe that system is not worth having. And you might want to actually take it off. But being forced to buy it for £1 and then spend £5,000 taking it off the roof is not great. So that's the other one to watch out for. What happens at the end of life? The other level of flexibility that the CBS offers is that the school can buy it back after 5 years if it happens to have the money, or can contribute to it. If you think of a mortgage, they can help repay the mortgage faster, and that then translates into a lower cost of electricity to them. The PPA can be reduced. So some of the schools that we work with are actually reinvesting their savings in accelerating the reduction of the PPA, or reduction of the time that they are under the contract. So it's worth just looking at the lease and the conditions within it. And it's definitely worth, as a council, investing some time in that, because once you've done it once, it's the same lease for all the schools from that particular provider. And it's the first lease with every council that's the hardest battle. But if you put the effort into it, they can work, and they do work. But just you need to put the time in and effort to understand them. So that's the legal piece. Then once the council's on board, the rest is relatively easy. But thank you for that question, James. I think it's a really, really, really good point.
We've got a few more questions in the chat. So I think Ellie Nathan's question was addressed by Anne, who is the director at the CBS. So welcome, Anne. I don't know if you want to voice the response that you've already given, just so that if anyone's missed it in the chat, you might cover it again.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so I think the question, Sanchi, thank you, was around the Secretary of State consent for councils who are looking to produce leases, or community energy groups who are looking to issue leases. And the answer was really around the fact that so long as the terms of the lease are right, and they're protecting the schools over the long term, then actually the process for gaining Secretary of State consent is fairly straightforward, and it's a process that we support the council in going forward. So I think that was the answer for Ellie and James on that subject.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of paperwork, but we do it all for you.
Thank you, Anne. We've got another question from Martin. In Hull, all our schools are academies. So what do you see our role in this?
Do you want me to answer that one?
Go for it.
Go for it.
So if you have a lot of academies, the role for the council is as the landlord, actually. So again, when you go to Secretary of State to get approval, they have to make sure that the landlord, the council, is supportive of the programme and knows about it. So we go through a process of looking for consent from the we call it the superior landlord, but from yourselves as the landlord, for those trusts to move forward to get their solar onto their roofs. So the support from the council is very much along the lines of being able to sign off and say that they're happy to support the schools, the academies going forward, and to give their superior consent for the installation.
Thank you, Anne. Anything to add to that, Robert?
Well, I was going to add to that. So one of the reasons that some councils have held back from investing in solar on their own schools is that sometimes they've done that and then the school goes and becomes an academy trust, and then they go, great, we put the money on a school that's no longer our direct responsibility. And so that's one of the advantages of, if they have it funded by a third party, then they haven't invested in that particular project. And when that project then, or that school then moves into a trust, they don't feel that they've kind of put the money in the wrong pot, and they can reserve the money for other projects. So that's a minor point, really. But I'm looking through lots of the questions and comments.
Got another question from Kath. Kath, I don't know if you want to say your question out loud. I know that in our conversation last week, you had a few other questions as well. So it might be a good opportunity to bring those up if they've not already been answered.
Well, I can't quite remember all of the questions that I sent over to you, because it was from a colleague. I think some of them have been answered, but it continues to raise more questions, which is great. And this is brilliant, actually. It's really helping. But specifically when you talked about, the first thing the councils need to do is to provide that approval to the idea of solar. That's the first stage, but ultimately the schools don't have the time or resource or even expertise to do it themselves. So we will have to take a leading role in this. So I just wondered what you thought on that.
And just to add to that, sorry, Robert, the questions that Kath had sent me last week were specifically pertaining to asset management, replacement costs, etc. So maybe you could speak about that after.
Okay. So in terms of the level of involvement of the council, so different countries work slightly differently. For example, and I'm just going to illustrate, in Germany, the schools have actually no say in what happens. Yeah, and we just work with the council. The council pays for the feasibility, the desktop pays for the feasibility and pays for the system, and the school just gets it. Yeah, easier and harder, less people to get to say yes, but also our education piece is kind of less valued by the council in Germany than it is in the UK. In the UK, it varies enormously. I mean, some councils like Leeds pretty much is in the driving seat. They decided that they're going to put a heat pump on this particular school, and therefore it needs to have solar too, and that's kind of happens. The school can stop it, but they rarely do. And it literally is by the way, you're next on the list to have a heat pump and solar, and they go, great, thank you. And that makes it very, very, very easy for the school. Doesn't mean that in the UK that you can do it without the school's consent, because at the end of the day, the governors still have to approve it. And for example, the GB Energy funding recently, amazingly, not every school that was eligible and offered it accepted it. There may be some very sensible reasons why not, but it's not completely automatic in the UK. But generally speaking, the more hands on the council, the easier it is you can make it for the school. Yes. I mean, most head teachers tell me that if a council turned up to them and said, look, here's a scheme, this is what it will cost you on your electricity price, this is what you're going to get from it, do you want to be part of it, yes or no? Most of them would say yes. Not every single one of them, but most of them would say yes. And just get on with it. What's really scary for them is if they go, oh my God, I have to do all my due diligence, I have to do all this, and then I have to persuade the council to do it, and then my God, who do I even speak to at the council? Then they just give up before they even start. And that's why the role of the council makes such a difference. Does that hopefully answer that question? Now then, on the asset management side of things, looking after these systems is really, really important. I mean, we estimate that about 3,000 schools in the UK had solar, and my joke goes that only half of them know they have it. And the reason for that is we often get called by a school because, oh, we'd like to have some solar panels. And we have a quick look at their roof and they go, oh, you've already got some. And they go, no, we haven't. Go, yes, you have, look. And they went, how interesting. We had no idea we had it. And we then turn up and sometimes discover that the system hasn't even been connected. It was built as part of a refurb and was never sort of commissioned, or run for a period of time and then stop working and no one ever noticed. And so looking after solar PV is really quite important, because although they're pretty reliable and they have no moving parts and reasonably safe, they still need looking after because they can cause a fire if ignored. And more often than not, they stop working and no one notices. And so that's a terrible waste of an investment. So asset management is really, really important. And that's why we kind of monitor every one of the systems that we look after. We install monitoring equipment and we check them every day. And then we do the visual inspection once a year and a full electrical check every 5 years. So one of the risks with schools installing it themselves is that, or getting a grant or a gift and having had panels installed, is that the business manager who's there might look after them for a couple of years, moves on, and the next business manager doesn't even know they exist and they get ignored. So ensuring that someone is looking after those systems is really important. And I'm not sure if that falls on the responsibility of the council or not, but ultimately they're your buildings. So yes, you probably should be checking that someone is keeping an eye on those solar panels, in the same way as someone checks all electrical systems in a school. Does that cover that? I can't see anyone's faces, so I have no idea if everyone's falling asleep or yawning or nodding.
Any reactions, any thumbs up or hearts if you're very happy with that response would be fantastic. Thank you. We've got another question from Catherine. What is the approach to managing the roof condition and the process there? We have had an example of a school who did their own PV panels some time ago, and it's then been incredibly costly for the LA to do roof repairs at a later date due to the complex process of removing PV panels and a requirement to do the work under a watching brief.
Oh, that's a very good point. So one of, again, the advantages of working more closely with councils when we are doing schools is if a school comes to us, we know nothing about the long-term plans for that school. And sometimes the school doesn't know either. So they go ahead, we look at the roof and we think the roof is in bad condition, we won't touch it. Or we know that they're thinking of redoing that roof, we wait until it's done. Now, the Solar for School CBS, as I mentioned before, has a budget built in for removing and replacing solar panels over the lifetime of the system, effectively once. Hopefully not every school will have to use it, but it's there. And I think Anne can give us the exact number, but every summer we remove and replace panels on about 5, this year it's about 5 schools. And if they're funded by the CBS covers those costs. If they're funded by a commercial funder, it depends on the terms of the lease. But typically, I think the Guinness ones are also paid for by the funder, so there's no cost to the school to remove them and replace them. What most schools within the CBS do, though, is when they apply for the grant to have their roof, they include the cost of removing and putting the panels on in order to protect the profit share in the club. But that's entirely up to them, and if they don't get it, they don't have to. But they're just trying to protect the profit share with it for the rest of the schools. And you can probably provide some figures on what it typically costs to remove and replace the panels, if that would be helpful. But I think the key thing, again, is working with the council beforehand. We can avoid putting solar on roofs that we know are going to be torn down or replaced. And council have a better view of that than the school sometimes.
I was going to say, just adding to Robert's point there, we do get contacted by councils and by schools where installations have been poorly done in the first place, and in one instance completely wrecked a roof. And it was a very costly exercise to actually remove the system. The school and the council then redid the roof, and then we replaced the system correctly. Because there is a correct way of installation. And I can see this highlighted in quite a few of the questions, is there's nervousness around, allowing somebody onto your roof, which is in perfectly good condition, to have an installation and then to find that the roof is leaking in some way as a result of that installation. So it's important where you're working with a community energy group to make sure that they are going to check that system once it's been installed, so that it has been done correctly, and if there are any issues, that they're responsible for going back and making good any subsequent problems that might arise as a result of putting the system up onto that roof. As a result, like Robert said, Solar for Schools CBS certainly will turn round and say to a council or a school, I'm sorry, we just can't install on that particular roof. It's very disappointing. Everybody's taken and gone on a certain journey, and they're very disappointed as a result of that. But as a community benefit society, we can't afford to be putting systems on roofs where there will be a problem later on. So I hope that helps.
I've got a couple of more questions. Two of them are from Emily Reed. Are there any examples of collective procurement of your services by groups of schools, or a procurement framework for solar services to make things easier? Is her first question. And her second question is around the schools that we have existing that we're working with in Devon, which maybe Anne, you could take. Emily, do you want to add to that? I saw your hand
no,
up.
actually, I just meant to put my thumb up to say thanks for doing it.
So I've now forgotten the first half of the question.
It was on procurement, but maybe Emily, you want to share?
So I'll answer the procurement one. So there is no, and Matt discovered this, there is no framework out there that covers the full end-to-end solution, from sort of working alongside you from selecting the schools, doing the desktop feasibility, doing the full studies, managing the procurement and construction process, looking after the assets and doing the education piece, and then helping you with the sort of funding options or managing the fund side of things in terms of billing and invoicing if you're doing a PPA. There is none. We have talked to I think it's YPO, to create such a framework. They were interested in doing that, but they're too busy. The same with Crown Commercial Services. We also know that Crown Commercial Services has a backlog of frameworks that they need to build or create, which I think the total aggregate amount of volume that would go through those frameworks is in the billions, and they just haven't got the capacity to do it. Now, we're starting to talk to one or two of the combined authorities, because they have funding for this sort of thing. And so I think one of the directions of travel, and it'd be really useful to get all your input on this, is if we worked with, say, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority to create such a framework, and then we could then put it on one of the platforms, and then we could obviously then sign up to that framework, and then it would make it easier for councils to select us or pick us off that framework. Would that make sense? Would that help? It'd be useful to get thumbs up or help or sort of some kind of feedback.
I mean, Solar Options for Schools, just to clarify that position, Solar Options for Schools and actually Solar for Schools CBS are on Crown Commercial Services. They are on a framework for solar installations. So that is a possible route to engaging with us. And then, Emily, on your question of do we have schools in Devon, at the moment, we don't have that many, actually. We have a lot of schools that are interested. We have a couple of multi-academy trusts that are interested, but they're just working through their sort of due diligence and process. But none at the moment actually in Devon. In Somerset, yes, but not quite in Devon.
If it's appropriate to tell me which multi-academy trusts in Devon, then it would be helpful to know so that we can, sort of.
Okay. Yeah, no, that'd be great. I mean, if you want to drop me an email, then we can liaise. Absolutely.
Thanks.
It's Anne at Solar for Schools.
I'll put her email in the chat. Don't worry. Just one more question from Jilly, I think, on the function of battery energy storage in the solar. So what do you think of the function of battery energy storage in solar?
One of my favorite questions. Thank you. So up until recently, adding a battery to a school was less effective than adding a battery, for example, to a house. A house, most people are out all day, sun's shining during the day, need the power at night. Schools need the power during the day, and so therefore the battery is less useful on a day-to-day basis. The other challenge is that schools are often closed typically closed on weekends in the summer. So in the summer, you're generating vast amounts, and so the battery fills up and stays full all summer. And in the winter, you're just not generating enough anyway. So the battery doesn't get used very much. So the utilization rate on a battery in a school compared to a home is much, much lower. Having said that, that's just a cost and economics thing. At some point, batteries get cheap enough that even if you're not using it that much in the summer and winter, it still starts to help in spring and autumn. And we've done some analysis recently on batteries, and we can increase the self-consumption rate of an oversized system on a small school by up to 80%. So what that means is more of the electricity from the system will be used by the school, and therefore we can bring down the overall price. Then is the difference more than enough to compensate for the capital cost of the battery? And so far, the answer is generally not, unless you can get a grant or a subsidy for the battery, or you can use the battery to do something else. And so we're working with a company who wants to aggregate a number of these batteries together to then provide grid balancing services and bid for the flexibility markets. You typically need to have a megawatt worth of capacity. So you probably need maybe 5 to 10 schools, each with a reasonably large battery, all combined to then be able to entertain or use those additional revenue streams. And then you use those additional revenue streams to pay for the battery. And in that situation, the battery to the school or to the CBS is effectively free, and therefore it makes a big difference and helps. And that's why, and I think I can probably say that Scottish Power Energy Networks, I think I've got the right acronym, is just about to work with us on £100,000 a year grant to put batteries into smaller schools to enable that to happen. And they will then make an exception in terms of the flexibility markets and start participating in those, even though they're smaller batteries. So where you can participate in flexibility markets, batteries are now starting to make sense. Otherwise, generally speaking, the battery's capital cost is greater than the additional value it provides. That's changing as those costs come down and continue to come down, and it's getting better. But 2 years ago, it made no sense at all. 2 years from now, it probably will make sense. And today, it makes sense if you can get the flexibility market additional bonus on top. I hope that answers that question.
I can see another question on whether the link to the CCS documents will be shared after, which Anne's already responded to. So thank you for that, Anne. I didn't know what CCS stood for. And then if there aren't any more questions, Robert, perhaps you could move on to closing remarks, because I realize we're over time now.
Yeah. One final question I saw, which is solar canopy or carports. Yes, we do that. Just expensive. Much, much more expensive. And they get hit by delivery trucks too, which is a bit of a nuisance sometimes. On closing remarks, thank you. I think just everyone will get a copy of this presentation and recording. Just make sure that you send an email to Sanchi if she doesn't have your details already. But I think the key point is merely making the right sounds or having pre-diligenced the legal frameworks of these leases so that you can tell the schools, yes, we've looked at these providers' leases, we're happy with them. And look at 2 or 3 or 4. Look at the local community energy is great one. And say, look, these ones, we're happy with the lease. Doesn't mean that we're endorsing it from a commercial perspective, but we're endorsing it from a landlord perspective. That alone makes a big difference. And if you are approached by a community energy group or commercial provider, do take the time to review their lease. It is possible to have leases that don't have contingent liabilities in them and not onerous on the council or the school. And if you can find those, please encourage them and help schools use them. Not necessarily ours, any one of them are out there. And if you have any questions, we're happy to help. Our goal is to manage those systems once they're up and running. We don't really mind how those systems happen, as long as they happen. Once they happen, we'd love to talk to you about looking after them and delivering the education piece.
Thank you, Robert. Anything from you, Anne? Any closing remarks?
Sorry, Sanchi, I keep putting myself on mute. No, I would reiterate what Robert says. You know, if as a council you're looking to really do something with your schools, either the maintained or working collaboratively with your multi-academy trusts, then please do reach out to us. We have a lot of experience, helping councils, helping schools, and helping those MATs achieve that solar objective for them. So please do reach out to us.
Brilliant. And with that, thank you so much for everyone attending and joining and for all of your questions. I think it's been a really, really good session. It's been a really big, large session. I think we almost had all 44 participants attending at one point. So thank you so much. I hope you all have a lovely day. You will be receiving the webinar recording and the slides by the end of the day today, as long as it is all edited and snipped up by me nicely. So thank you so much for attending, and thank you all for being here, and have a nice day.